The courthouse records in a small Virginia county contain something extraordinary. Tucked between land deeds and birth certificates, there are detailed accounts of 11 unsolved murders, all resolved within a single decade. The sheriff who signed these reports received commendations, newspaper headlines, even a bronze plaque that still hangs in the county museum. But if you read the actual case files, you'll notice something strange. In the margins, written in different handwriting, there are observations the sheriff couldn't possibly have made. Deductions about soil composition, blood spatter patterns, and behavioral psychology that wouldn't become common knowledge for another 50 years. And at the bottom of each file, in the same careful script, appear the initials JT, a name that never appeared in any newspaper, never received any recognition, and was deliberately scratched out of the official record after the sheriff's death. The reason was simple. JT wasn't just the man who solved these crimes. He was property. Before we continue with the story of how one man's genius was stolen by history, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit the notification bell and leave a comment telling us which state you're watching from. Stories like this need to be heard. Now, to understand how a slave became the most brilliant criminal investigator in Virginia and how his name was erased from every record, we need to go back to where it all started. Dalton County, Virginia in 1847 was a place caught between two worlds. Nestled in the Piedmont region, where rolling hills gave way to the first shadows of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the county seat of Harpersville had grown prosperous on tobacco farming and the railway line that connected it to Richmond. 3,000 people called it home. 2,000 white, 800 enslaved, 200 free black residents who lived in the margins of both communities. The town's main street ran for 6 blocks lined with brick buildings that housed a bank, 2 churches, a general store, a tavern, and the county courthouse, a Greek Revival structure with white columns that represented law and order, at least for some. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock had held his position for 4 years, elected primarily because his family owned the second largest plantation in the county. He was a man of average intelligence and abundant pride. With a thick mustache he waxed daily and a reputation for solving exactly 0 crimes of any complexity. The truth was, Dalton County hadn't needed much law enforcement. Petty thefts, the occasional tavern brawl, property disputes, these were Whitlock's domain, and he managed them with a combination of intimidation and family connections. But that changed in the spring of 1847 when the body was found. Young Margaret Hayes, 17 years old and daughter of the county's wealthiest merchant, was discovered in Blackwell Creek, 3 miles from town. Her pale blue dress was torn, her bonnet missing, and her neck bore bruising that suggested strangulation. The discovery sent shockwaves through Harpersville's white community. Women refused to leave their homes without male escorts. Church attendance doubled overnight, and Sheriff Whitlock, who had never investigated a murder, found himself under intense pressure to deliver swift justice. He questioned the usual suspects, drifters, free black men who happened to be near the creek that week, even a mentally disabled stable hand who couldn't have harmed anyone. But he had no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no idea what he was doing. The investigation stalled within a week. That's when Thomas Whitlock did something that would change both their lives forever. He turned to his youngest slave, a 22-year-old man named Josiah Turner. Josiah was not supposed to be remarkable. Born on the Whitlock plantation to a mother who had died in childbirth and a father he never knew, he had been raised primarily in the big house where old Mrs. Whitlock, Thomas's mother, had taken a controversial interest in his upbringing. She taught him to read from her worn Bible, initially just so he could recite scripture to her in her declining years. But Josiah had learned with the speed that alarmed the household. By age 8, he could read anything placed before him. By 10, he had somehow gained access to Mr. Whitlock Sr.'s library, a collection of law books, medical texts, and scientific journals that the old man had accumulated but rarely opened. When Thomas Whitlock inherited the plantation after his father's death, he discovered Josiah reading a treatise on human anatomy in the library. Rather than punish him, Whitlock had seen an opportunity. He began using Josiah as a personal secretary of sorts, having him read documents and summarize their contents. Josiah's mind worked differently than other people's. He noticed patterns, inconsistencies, details that others overlooked. And now, desperate to solve the Hayes murder before the county lost faith in him entirely, Sheriff Whitlock made Josiah an offer. "You help me figure out who killed that girl," Whitlock said one evening in the study, tobacco smoke curling toward the ceiling. "And I'll make sure you get Sunday afternoons to yourself. More food rations. Might even let you keep some of those books." Josiah had no choice, of course, but he also had curiosity, a dangerous trait for a slave, but one he couldn't suppress. He agreed. What neither man realized was that this arrangement would become something far more complex and far more dangerous than either could imagine. The morning Sheriff Whitlock took Josiah to Blackwell Creek marked the first time a slave had been brought to a crime scene in any official capacity. Whitlock was careful about it. They traveled before dawn when the roads were empty, and he made Josiah walk 3 paces behind his horse. There could be no appearance of equality, even in private. The creek ran cold and swift that May morning, fed by mountain runoff. Pine trees pressed close to the water's edge, their shadows still deep in the early light. The spot where Margaret Hayes's body had been found was marked by trampled grass. 24 men had already walked through, contaminating whatever evidence might have existed. "So," Whitlock said, dismounting and lighting a cigar, "what do you see?" Josiah stood silent for a long moment, his eyes moving across the scene with methodical precision. He was tall and lean with close cropped hair and hands scarred from years of field work before Mrs. Whitlock had moved him to house duties. His face remained carefully neutral, the expression of a man who had learned to hide his thoughts. "May I walk around, sir?" he asked quietly. Whitlock waved his hand impatiently. "That's why I brought you." Josiah moved slowly along the creek bank, crouching occasionally to examine the mud, the stones, the broken branches of a willow tree that hung over the water. He walked upstream, then downstream, covering nearly a 4 mile in each direction. Whitlock grew impatient, smoking 3 cigars while Josiah worked in silence. Finally, Josiah returned. "She wasn't killed here, sir." Whitlock frowned. "What do you mean?" "Body was found right here." "Yes, sir. But if you look at the mud on the bank, you can see where the body was dragged. The grass is flattened moving toward the water, not away from it. And there's no blood in the soil, even though her dress had bloodstains on the hem." "The coroner said she had a head wound, didn't he?" Whitlock nodded slowly. He hadn't actually paid much attention to the coroner's report. "A head wound bleeds considerably, sir. If she'd been struck here, there would be evidence. But the only blood is on her clothing, which means she was moved after death, probably carried or dragged from somewhere else and placed in the creek to make it look like an accident or to wash away evidence. And you can tell all that from some bent grass." Whitlock's tone was skeptical, but interested. "Not just the grass, sir." Josiah pointed upstream. "There are wheel marks about 200 yards that way where someone drove a cart close to the creek. Recent marks. The rain we had 2 nights ago would have washed away anything older. And if you look at the gravel near the water's edge, there's a partial footprint, a man's boot, size 11 or 12, heavy tread, military style, not common in these parts." Whitlock stared at him. "How in God's name can you see all that?" Josiah didn't answer directly. "Sir, may I ask, did Miss Hayes have a suitor? Someone she might have been meeting in secret?" The question was bold, perhaps too bold. Whitlock's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern." "No, sir. But if we're looking for who might have wanted her alone, away from town, we need to understand who she trusted enough to meet." The logic was sound, and Whitlock knew it. He took a long draw on his cigar. "There was a soldier, Captain's son from Richmond, stationed at the garrison near Charlottesville. Samuel Pritchard. The Hayes family didn't approve. Thought he was after Margaret's inheritance. She was forbidden from seeing him." Was Captain Pritchard's son questioned. "Sir, He was in Charlottesville as witnesses. Josiah nodded slowly. And the cart? Who in Harpersville owns a cart that could make those marks? This investigation continued for 3 more days with Josiah accompanying Whitlock on interviews, always waiting outside, of course, listening through windows when possible. And then Josiah found something that changed everything. In the Hayes family stable, hidden beneath loose hay in an empty stall, Josiah discovered a woman's bonnet. Blue ribbon, expensive lace, exactly matching the description of what Margaret Hayes had been wearing. But more importantly, there were bloodstains on the inside crown. And caught in the ribbon was a single dark hair that clearly didn't belong to the blonde victim. When confronted, the Hayes' stable master, a middle-aged man named Douglas Fletcher, broke down immediately. The story came out in choking sobs. Margaret had indeed been meeting Lieutenant Pritchard in secret, using Fletcher to carry messages and arrange meetings, but Fletcher had developed his own obsession with the girl. When she rejected his advances one evening in the stable, he struck her with a shovel. The blow killed her instantly. Panicked, Fletcher had taken her body in his cart to Blackwell Creek, trying to stage an accident. The confession was thorough. Fletcher was arrested, tried, and hanged within 6 weeks. And Sheriff Thomas Whitlock became a hero. The Harperville Gazette ran the headline, "Sheriff Whitlock brings swift justice in Hayes murder." The article praised his keen eye for detail and relentless pursuit of truth. The Richmond papers picked up the story. At the county fair that summer, Whitlock was presented with a certificate of commendation. Josiah's name appeared nowhere. When he had suggested showing Sheriff Whitlock the bonnet, Whitlock had gone into the stable alone, discovered it himself, and taken full credit. Josiah had expected nothing different. But what he hadn't expected was that this would become a pattern, because 6 weeks after Fletcher's execution, another body was found. And once again, Sheriff Whitlock turned to the slave who solved crimes. The second murder was different. This time, the victim was a slave. His name was Benjamin, owned by the Patterson family, who ran the textile mill on the Shenandoah River's edge. Benjamin had been found in the mill's lower level, crushed beneath a fallen beam. At first, everyone assumed it was an accident. Mills were dangerous places, and slaves died in industrial accidents regularly enough that few questions were typically asked. But Benjamin's wife, Dinah, refused to accept that explanation. She went to the sheriff herself. A dangerous act of boldness that could have gotten her whipped. She stood in the courthouse lobby and told anyone who would listen that Benjamin had been murdered, that the beam had been deliberately loosened, that her husband had been killed because he'd seen something he shouldn't have. Most people dismissed her. But Thomas Whitlock, still basking in his newfound reputation, saw another opportunity. If he could solve even a slave's murder, his legend would grow. He brought Josiah to the mill the next morning. The textile mill was a 3-story brick building that shook with the rhythm of mechanical looms. The air was thick with cotton dust that coated your throat and stung your eyes. The lower level, where Benjamin had died, was used for storage, and the massive wheel that powered the mill's machinery through a series of belts and gears. Josiah examined the beam that had fallen. It was solid oak weighing several hundred pounds, and it had indeed crushed Benjamin's chest, killing him instantly. But when Josiah looked at where the beam had been mounted to the wall, he noticed something. The bolt holes had been recently widened. Fresh wood showed through where metal had scraped away the aged timber. Someone had deliberately weakened the mounting so that the beam would fall. "Who worked down here with Benjamin?" Josiah asked quietly. Whitlock consulted his notes. 3 other men, all slaves. "I'd like to speak with them, sir, and with Dinah." She said Benjamin had seen something. "We need to know what." This investigation was more delicate. Slaves were reluctant to speak openly, even to other slaves, when a white man was present. But Josiah had a network that Sheriff Whitlock knew nothing about. A quiet community of enslaved people who shared information through coded conversations, Sunday church meetings, and the invisible channels of communication that existed beneath white supervision. Through these channels, Josiah learned what Benjamin had seen. The Patterson family's eldest son, Marcus Patterson, had been stealing from his own family's mill, skimming profits, altering ledgers, and selling bolts of cloth through a dealer in Richmond without recording the sales. Benjamin, who worked in the storage area where inventory was kept, had noticed the discrepancies. He'd mentioned it to Marcus, thinking perhaps there was some mistake he could help correct. 2 days later, Benjamin was dead. But proving this was another matter entirely. Josiah couldn't simply accuse Marcus Patterson, the son of one of the county's most prominent families, based on the testimony of slaves. He needed physical evidence, and he found it in the mill's account books. Late one night, while Sheriff Whitlock was sleeping off whiskey at the tavern, Josiah made his way back to the mill. He knew it was dangerous. A slave caught out after dark could be shot without question. But he also knew that Marcus Patterson kept the mill's financial records in an office on the second floor. The lock on the office door was simple. Josiah had learned lock-picking from a book on engineering he'd read in old Mr. Whitlock's library. The book had included diagrams of various locking mechanisms, and Josiah's mind had naturally understood how to reverse the process. Inside the office by candlelight, he found what he was looking for. 2 sets of ledgers, the official one, which matched the quarterly report submitted to the Patterson family, and a second ledger hidden in a locked drawer that showed the actual inventory and sales. The discrepancy amounted to nearly $2,000 over 18 months, a fortune. Josiah couldn't take the evidence himself. Instead, he arranged for Sheriff Whitlock to discover it. He left the office door unlocked. The hidden ledger prominently displayed on the desk and made an anonymous tip to Whitlock through a free black man who worked as a courier. When confronted with the evidence, Marcus Patterson did something unexpected. He confessed immediately, but not to murder. He admitted the theft, claimed Benjamin's death was genuinely an accident, and offered to make full restitution to his family. His lawyer argued that there was no direct evidence linking Patterson to the beam's sabotage. After all, anyone could have loosened those bolts. The case went to trial, and Patterson was found guilty of fraud, but not murder. He served 2 years in prison and returned to Harpersville as if nothing had happened. Benjamin's widow, Dinah, received no compensation, no justice, no acknowledgement. But once again, Sheriff Whitlock was praised in the newspapers for uncovering a complex fraud scheme and demonstrating integrity by investigating even when the victim was Negro property. Josiah's name, of course, appeared nowhere. But something was changing among Harpersville's enslaved community. Word was spreading. There was a man who could see things others couldn't, who could find truth in lies, who could help. Slaves began finding ways to get information to Josiah about thefts, about beatings that went beyond the normal cruelty of enslavement, about deaths that seemed suspicious. And Thomas Whitlock, recognizing that his reputation depended on Josiah's abilities, allowed this network to grow. He even protected it in his way by looking the other way when Josiah needed to be out after curfew or when he needed to speak with people without supervision. It was a strange partnership, master and slave, sheriff and investigator. One man taking all the credit while the other did all the work. But it was also something neither of them had anticipated. It was effective. Over the next 8 years, Josiah would help solve 11 murders, dozens of thefts, and 3 cases of arson. He developed methods of investigation that wouldn't become standard practice until decades later, documenting crime scenes with detailed sketches, analyzing blood spatter, interviewing witnesses separately to catch contradictions, even studying the behavior of suspects to identify psychological patterns. But he did all of this in silence, in shadow, and without recognition. Because no matter how brilliant his deductions, no matter how many lives were saved or crimes solved, Josiah Turner remained property. And property doesn't get credit. Property doesn't get its name in newspapers. Property doesn't get justice. It merely serves those who do. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. It's not just that Josiah's contributions were ignored during his lifetime. It's what happened after he died when someone tried to set the record straight. By 1855, Josiah Turner had become indispensable to Thomas Whitlock. The sheriff's reputation now stretched beyond Dalton County. He was known throughout Virginia as a lawman of exceptional skill, and there had even been talk of him running for state legislature. None of it would have been possible without Josiah's mind working behind the scenes. But the arrangement was becoming increasingly dangerous. As Josiah's abilities grew, so did his boldness. He was no longer content to simply observe and deduce. He wanted to understand why crimes happened, what drove people to violence, what patterns of human behavior could predict future actions. He began keeping his own records hidden in the small cabin he shared with 3 other slaves on the Whitlock property. These records were detailed case files written in small careful script on whatever paper he could acquire. Pages torn from old account books, the backs of discarded notices, even birch bark when nothing else was available. The files contained everything Sheriff Whitlock's official reports left out: the actual methods of investigation, the logical reasoning behind each deduction, the questions that had been asked and why. In essence, Josiah was documenting his own work, creating a record that proved what he had done. It was also evidence that a slave could read and write, which was illegal in Virginia. If discovered, the punishment would be severe. The third murder that truly tested Josiah's abilities came in the autumn of 1855, and it was unlike anything Harpersville had seen. This time, it wasn't one victim. It was 4. The first body was found on a Monday morning. George Hamilton, a wealthy landowner, was discovered in his study with a knife wound to the chest. The house hadn't been robbed. Nothing was disturbed, and there were no signs of forced entry. 2 days later, his business partner, Edward Clay, was found dead in his carriage on the road to Richmond, strangled with a length of rope. On Friday, Hamilton's lawyer, a man named Theodore Walsh, died in what appeared to be a fall down his stairs, but the bruising suggested he'd been pushed. And on Sunday, the local banker who had handled all 3 men's accounts, Robert Finch, was found poisoned in his home. 4 prominent men dead. Within a week, panic seized Harpersville like a fever. Wild theories spread. A killer was targeting the town's elite. Some kind of conspiracy. Perhaps even retribution for unpaid debts. Sheriff Whitlock was overwhelmed. The pressure from the victims' families, from the town council, from the newspapers was intense. He turned to Josiah with desperation in his eyes. "Find me the connection," Whitlock said. "There has to be a reason all 4 of them were killed." Josiah spent 3 days reviewing financial records, interviewing household staff, and examining each crime scene. What he discovered was a web of fraud that went back 15 years. Hamilton, Clay, Walsh, and Finch had been operating a land scheme together, selling property to immigrant families arriving from Ireland and Germany, taking their money, and then using legal technicalities to invalidate the sales and resell the same land to others. They defrauded dozens of families, accumulating wealth while their victims lost everything. But who had killed them? The answer came from an unlikely source, a 15-year-old boy named Patrick O'Connor, whose family had been among the scheme's victims. His father had hanged himself 2 years earlier after losing their farm. His mother had died of cholera the following winter. Patrick had been surviving on odd jobs and charity, living in a shed behind the church. When Josiah interviewed him carefully, quietly, away from official scrutiny, the boy admitted nothing at first. But Josiah noticed things. Rope burns on Patrick's hands, a slight limp that suggested recent injury, and most tellingly, the smell of bitter almonds on his jacket, a residue of the arsenic that had killed the banker. Josiah faced an impossible choice. Patrick O'Connor had committed 4 murders, but he had done so to avenge his family's destruction at the hands of men who would never have faced legal consequences for their fraud. In the moral calculus of Virginia law, fraud against immigrants meant nothing, but murder meant the gallows. Josiah made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He told Sheriff Whitlock everything except Patrick's name. Instead, he pointed Whitlock toward a drifter who had been seen near town around the time of the murders. A man with a criminal record from Pennsylvania who had no family, no connections, and no way to prove his innocence effectively. The drifter was arrested, tried, and convicted on circumstantial evidence that Josiah had carefully constructed. He was hanged on a cold December morning, proclaiming his innocence until the rope silenced him. Patrick O'Connor left Harpersville a week later and was never seen again. Sheriff Whitlock received his highest commendation yet. The Richmond newspapers called the case a masterwork of criminal investigation and praised Whitlock's brilliant deductive reasoning. A bronze plaque was commissioned for the courthouse, celebrating his career of bringing justice to the citizens of Dalton County. But Josiah knew the truth. For the first time, he had deliberately condemned an innocent man to protect a guilty one. He had used his gift for reading evidence, for seeing what others couldn't see, not to serve justice, but to save someone he believed deserved saving. It was the moment he understood the true cost of working within a system that was itself unjust. That winter, Josiah wrote something in his hidden files that he had never written before. At the bottom of the O'Connor case notes, he added, "I have become what I hunted. God forgive me." The files grew thicker, more cases, more criminals caught, more headlines for Sheriff Whitlock, but also more compromises. More moments when Josiah had to choose between the letter of the law and what he believed was right. A slave who stole food to feed his family, Josiah found evidence but buried it. A woman who killed her abusive husband, Josiah constructed an alternative explanation that led to an accidental death ruling. A free black man falsely accused of assault. Josiah found the real perpetrator, but had to work carefully to ensure the evidence came to light without revealing his own involvement. He was no longer just solving crimes. He was trying to protect those the law refused to protect within a system designed to deny them protection. And then everything changed because someone noticed what Josiah was doing. Her name was Clara Harth and she was something unusual in 1850s Virginia. A female journalist. She wrote for the Richmond Herald under her father's byline since newspapers wouldn't publish articles written by women. But Clara had a sharp mind and a nose for stories that others missed. In the spring of 1856, she came to Harpersville to write about Sheriff Whitlock's remarkable career. She interviewed him for hours, reviewed his case files, and spoke with people throughout the county. And slowly, she began to notice inconsistencies. Whitlock's official reports often contained observations that seemed beyond his capabilities. He supposedly noticed details about soil composition, blood patterns, and forensic analysis that Clara knew were cutting-edge techniques only being discussed in European scientific journals. How could a rural Virginia sheriff with no formal education be applying methods that experts in London and Paris were just beginning to develop? Clara did something that no journalist had done before. She started asking slaves what they knew about the investigations. Most refused to speak with her. A white woman asking questions was dangerous. But eventually, through patient persistence, she found someone willing to talk. A housemaid named Rachel who worked at the Whitlock plantation told Clara about Josiah. "He's the one who figures things out," Rachel said carefully. "Sheriff, just sit down." Clara wanted to interview Josiah directly, but that was impossible. Slaves couldn't be quoted in newspapers, couldn't be acknowledged as sources, and certainly couldn't be credited with intellectual work. But Clara was determined to find the truth. She began investigating Josiah's background, tracking down people who had known him, trying to understand how a slave had developed such extraordinary abilities. What she discovered should have been impossible. Old Mrs. Whitlock, now deceased, had apparently allowed Josiah access to an extensive library. Former household staff remembered seeing him reading medical texts, legal documents, even scientific journals. One elderly gardener recalled seeing Josiah conducting what looked like experiments in a shed behind the property, mixing chemicals, examining plant specimens under a crude magnifying glass he'd somehow constructed. Clara realized she had found a story far more important than a successful sheriff. She had found evidence of genius thriving in chains, of a mind that had educated itself beyond the limits of its circumstances. She wanted to write about Josiah to make his contributions known, to expose the injustice of his stolen recognition. But when she approached her editor with the story, he refused to publish it. "You can't print a story claiming a Negro slave is outsmarting white lawmen," he told her bluntly. "Do you understand what that would do? The social order depends on the belief that the colored race is inferior. You publish this, You're not just telling a story. You're challenging the entire foundation of Southern society. Clara argued. She pleaded. She even threatened to take the story to Northern newspapers, but her editor gave her an ultimatum: drop the story or lose her position at the paper. She chose to lose her position. For the next 2 years, Clara tried to publish Josiah's story in every newspaper she could reach. The Northern papers were more sympathetic to abolitionist causes, but even they balked at running an article that would rely heavily on unprovable claims. Without official documents bearing Josiah's name, without testimony she could publish, without any hard evidence beyond circumstantial observations and second-hand accounts, Clara couldn't prove what she knew to be true. She tried a different approach. She reached out to abolition societies thinking they might be interested in documenting Josiah's story as proof of black intellectual capacity. But here she encountered a different problem. Many abolitionists, while opposed to slavery, still held beliefs in racial intellectual differences. The idea that a slave could develop advanced forensic methods threatened their own frameworks of understanding. Clara refused to give up. In 1858, she did something remarkable and dangerous. She traveled to Harpersville personally, rented a small room above the general store, and spent 3 months documenting every case Sheriff Whitlock had solved. She reviewed courthouse records, interviewed witnesses, and slowly, carefully made contact with Josiah himself. They met 3 times, always in secret, always at tremendous risk. If they were discovered, Josiah would likely be sold away, or worse, teaching a slave to read was illegal. But a slave writing detailed criminal investigations could be seen as potential for insurrection planning. Clara could be charged with inciting rebellion. During these meetings, Josiah showed Clara his hidden files. She read through years of meticulous case notes, brilliant deductions, and disturbing,